because I don't know about y'all. This has been so helpful for me.
I think there's one more issue that we need to discuss in Revelation 20. Yeah. And then, because I just want to know your answer. So I see the first and second resurrection in Revelation 20 as a literal bodily resurrection of believers in the first resurrection and a literal bodily resurrection of unbelievers in the second resurrection. And I believe he is alluding to Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, the resurrection of the just and the unjust, some to everlasting life and others to everlasting shame and contempt. And so my question for you would be, is the resurrection, anastasis there, in Revelation 20, the first resurrection and the second resurrection, are those resurrections of the same nature? Are they both bodily resurrection, or are they not?
I knew we'd finally get to a place where I was going to have to admit I'm not an expert. But I'm thinking that, and I might be totally wrong, and not the post-mill position, but I'm thinking that that particular first resurrection is speaking of what we would call in systematic theology the regeneration. We're being passed from death to life. And so that's the first resurrection. And then the second resurrection is the bodily resurrection.
Yeah, that is the and post, the distinctive, and that's what I think Brian was asking. Is there a distinction between his view and our view on that? And that the answer would be yes, Brian.
Yeah, so why should we understand the second resurrection to be a literal bodily resurrection a few verses later, but not to be a bodily resurrection a few verses earlier? What's the reason for interpreting the same word in two very different ways in that same passage?
Well, let me just say this. As Don indicated, this is a strong point for premillennialism. There's no doubt about it. So when N.T. Wright wrote his book on the resurrection, he listed the word for resurrect, the Greek word, which is what? Right?
Anastasis.
Yeah, say it again.
Anastasis.
Anastasis. And he brings out the point that the word anastasis always refers to a physical resurrection, unless it's Revelations 20.
And only in verse 5.
And only in verse 5.
And not when it occurs a few verses later.
And that is a strong argument. The and post position for that would be this. And I am certainly no one to really argue this. This would be something for, N.T. Wright or somebody like that to argue. But I'll try. The argument is that this is a specific genre of text, and that in the specific genre of text, which is apocalyptic, in apocalyptic literature, the definition of the word is heavily tied to the context, and in the context, Amillennialists would argue that there is a first resurrection, which is not physical, and there is a second resurrection, which is physical. So amillennialists and postmillennialists would argue that in Revelation 20, there's only two resurrections.
So Revelation 20 says that the second resurrection is of unbelievers, and over the ones who are in the second resurrection, death has power over them, and they'll be cast into the lake of fire. So if there's only one bodily resurrection, and that's the second one, and that's the one that John tells us everyone who's raised in it will be cast into the lake of fire, which resurrection are you in?
So, it goes like this. In verse 4, it says he sees thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. Now, millennialists and postmillennialists would argue that that is not just beheaded witnesses, that is every Christian who has come to life spiritually. Now, there is a weakness in the premillennial perspective here, and that is it specifically says beheaded people. So I'm assuming that you wouldn't argue that the only ones who had received the first resurrection would be those who had been beheaded, martyrs, but would be all kinds.
Well, I would say, like so many other things in Revelation, beheaded is not necessarily literally beheaded.
We would agree.
But it speaks of the persecution of believers, and I believe every true believer will be persecuted. That's what
we would agree with that.
2 Timothy 3 verse 12 says, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Yeah. And I believe those who are beheaded for the testimony of Christ refers to those who have been persecuted by this world. So they didn't, like if they were, had a spear run through them instead of being decapitated, it's not like they won't participate in the first resurrection.
I would agree with you there. So I think that's how I interpret that view. Again, this is a matter of perspective. I think John is showing us perspectives of the victory of Christ ultimately over sin. One of the perspectives is that Christ has been victorious over sin by bringing spiritual life to his people, and I think that's the first resurrection. So, if there's a first resurrection, there's necessarily a second resurrection. The second resurrection would pertain to all people, whether they be in Christ or not. So that's why he says it's better if you have experienced the first resurrection, you won't have to experience the second death. So I think there's a parallel between the first resurrection, the second resurrection, and the first death and the second death.
So those who are resurrected are those who were beheaded for the testimony. So believers who were persecuted by the world, they were raised with Christ. Now, so they were beheaded, and then John sees them coming to life and reigning for 1,000 years. They're resurrected. Is it your position that they were beheaded for the testimony of Christ before they were regenerated, before they had saving faith? Because in Revelation 20, they are beheaded, and then later they experience the first resurrection. So if the first resurrection is regeneration, then wouldn't you have to understand that they were willing to be beheaded for a gospel that they didn't yet believe?
No, if you're using
it's just a picture. It's a picture.
Yeah, if you're using an idealistic linear progression, then that would make sense. But if you're not, then you don't have to have that.
Yeah, because it goes back to what I said at the beginning of the hermeneutics of letting difficult passages be explained by the plain passages. So we have all of the rest of the New Testament giving us our systematic theology of how it works, and then we have a picture of it there in an impressionistic picture of it there in the book of Revelation, that it's this people who were regenerated, and our first resurrection, those that have passed from death into life, those that have been suffering persecution, that's all the same group. And so that's what he's painting the picture of. It's not a linear progression.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, no, we're not talking about the whole book, though. We're just talking about from verse 4 to verse 5.
Yeah, I think verse 4 and verse 5 is a symbolic picture of all the saints who've been regenerated and have experienced persecution.
So, I think after this we'll be done, but this is a key point that if you believe that the first resurrection in Revelation 20 verse 5 is a physical bodily resurrection, then you have to be a premillennialist, because after that Christ reigns for 1,000 years, and then at the end of his reign for 1,000 years there's a second resurrection and a final judgment. So
that may be the case.
Yeah. So if you understand the first resurrection literally and in the same way as you understand the second resurrection, it's just the first one is of believers and the second is of unbelievers. The first one being before the millennium and the second one being after the millennium. If you understand it literally, you have to be a premillennialist by definition.
Yeah.
And so I don't see, it's the same vision. I think it is a linear progression in the same vision. I do think there's some recapitulation between the various visions in Revelation, but I mean, certainly we would all agree that from verse 4 to verse 5, it's not like a separate vision starts in verse 5. So in the same vision, he first sees these saints who, let me read it again, verse 4, "Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed, and I also saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God." So he sees the souls of believers with Christ in heaven, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image and not received its mark on their forehead or their hands, which means they didn't go along with the evil world system, right? They followed Christ instead. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This, that is, those who came to life and reigned with Christ, this is the first resurrection. So if you understand that as just a straightforward, this is what I saw in my vision, I think if you understand it in that way, you have to be a premillennialist.
I would agree. But amillennialists would not understand it that way. So they would, and nor would postmillennialists. They would say that what John is describing here is the history of redemption. So they would say that, for example, they came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. Of course, they would say 1,000 years, as we talked about earlier, is not a literal 1,000 years, but it's a symbolic period of time. So that's the church age. And then they would say that the first resurrection was the way to experience the church age. In other words, the entrance into the church was through the first resurrection. And then that verse 6 says, "Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection." So that's regeneration and salvation.
Okay, so then my question would be in verse 5. Mm-hmm. So after the first resurrection, it says, "The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended."
Right.
The rest of the dead, does that refer to unbelievers?
Yes.
So in what way do unbelievers come to life?
The resurrection.
Bodily resurrection. So in the first resurrection, it's speaking of spiritual resurrection only.
Right.
In the second resurrection, those who weren't regenerated are bodily raised.
Right.
When are believers bodily raised?
Well, no, everybody would be resurrection.
But those who were bodily raised in verse 5 are those who did not participate in the first resurrection. It says, "They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years, and the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended." So there's a distinction between those who participated in the first resurrection and the second. And as I'm reading the end of verse 4 and the beginning of verse 5, one group participates in the first resurrection, and the rest, a separate group, participates in the second resurrection.
Right. Yeah, that's
well,
right.
No. If you agree with that, you would be a premillennialist.
Well, maybe I misunderstood what you just said.
So the first resurrection is of believers.
Yeah.
The second resurrection is the rest of the dead.
Right.
And if they're not believers, they're unbelievers.
Right.
And those who are raised in the second resurrection come to life at the end of the 1,000 years.
Well, so what they would say, and what I believe is right, is that the coming to life in verse 4, is that still 4? That's a long verse. In verse 4, "and reigning with Christ for 1,000 years," that's Christians, okay? "And that the rest of the dead did not come to life until 1,000 years were ended," that verse 5 represents a physical resurrection that would, I think I understand where you're asking me now.
Yeah, so
would include, the physical resurrection would include both saved and unsaved bodies. Their bodies would be resurrected.
And so, just to finish the point, my issue with what you're saying is verse 5, the rest of the dead, distinguishes that group from the group that was raised in verse 4. And so I don't believe the rest of the dead refers to believers as well. I guess you would have to. And I think exegetically there's no reason to see, like, the first group is believers are spiritually raised through regeneration, through being saved, right? And then in verse 5, the rest of the dead includes the group that was mentioned in verse 4, because I think the rest of the dead distinguishes that group from the group just mentioned in verse 4. And you would have to say it doesn't, because otherwise believers wouldn't be bodily resurrected.
Well, I tend, like I said earlier, I tend to agree that this is a strong argument for premillennialists, but there is weaknesses here. First of all, the beheaded part is a weakness, but verse 6 is a weakness too, to that perspective, because it says, "Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection." So, are you contending that that it is more blessed? Is there some? And maybe you are. Maybe premillennialists do believe this, that there's some blessed distinction. If you're saying that the first resurrection are those who've been beheaded or persecuted, however you want to interpret that, is that what verse 6 is referring to?
Well, so all believers will be persecuted.
Right.
And all believers will be resurrected.
Right, but not all believers will be beheaded or persecuted to death. Right.
Beheading, not taking the mark of the beast, I think all those are symbolic. Would you agree that the mark of the beast is symbolic?
Yeah.
So could not beheading also be symbolic when it's mentioned?
I think it is.
In the same verse?
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, so you're suggesting then that blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection, that's every believer.
Yes.
Okay.
Every believer will be persecuted, and every believer will participate in the first resurrection, which will happen at the moment that Jesus returns to the earth.
Well, I mean, I would agree with that, certainly. But that's the distinction between amillennialism.
Yeah, the difference, you would agree with that. I would go one step further and say, and the resurrection when Jesus returns to the earth, I would go one step further and say, and that's the first resurrection that verse 4 and verse 6 refers to.
Okay, I got you.
All right.
You have an insight into that?
No, I don't know.
I think that probably is the strongest.
I thought this wasn't a debate. I thought this wasn't a debate.
Well, no, it's a discussion. Look, can I say something real positive about amillennialism? I agree with everything that amillennialism asserts in its theological conclusions. I just think that premillennialism believes some additional things will happen in the future that amillennialists don't necessarily have to believe. In other words, I believe that premillennialism, in what I believe will happen in the future, encapsulates all of what amillennialists say. Mm-hmm. Premillennialists believe a few additional things will happen in the future that amillennialists don't necessarily believe. And postmillennialists believe that additional things will happen, but they're different than the things that I believe in. Meaning, postmillennialists believe in a reign on the earth through the church without Christ being present. I believe in a reign on the earth with Christ being present. So Don and I would have...
Physically.
Yes.
Because Christ is with us.
Yeah, physically present. That's right. Present with his people, of course. Physically.
Yeah, but when
I believe Christ is with us now, but physically on the earth during the millennium. So
keeping office hours. And
if I can just, because I mean, I was a little tough on you in the cross examination there, but only to show where the differences are in how we exegete the text. But our three views are very similar with one another. I mean, wouldn't you guys agree with that?
Well, but there's a distinction here, though, that I may be missing. So when Christ comes back from a postmillennial perspective, there is no millennial reign. That's it, right?
Then the eternal state.
Yeah,
so the last day.
So yeah, so I mean,
and
I believe that,
and that's what I'm saying. So, amillennialism, correct me if I'm wrong, would be we're going to preach the gospel. Jesus is going to come back, and when he comes back, final judgment, eternal state. Right?
Yes.
I would add to that. There will be a millennium between the return of Christ and the final judgment. Don would add to that, there will be a millennium, but it will be before the return of Christ. That's what I meant when I said
Well,
Pre and postmillennialism encapsulate everything amillennialism asserts. Premillennium and postmillennium assert a literal earthly kingdom. Don says it will be before the return of Christ. I say it will be after.
right, exactly. Yeah.
And Brian, I'll just echo what you said. I think we're closer than I realized because I told Adam and Rusty that I was not very familiar with the historic premill position, and it's much more different than the dispensational premillennial position than I realized. And so I learned a lot today. And so very interesting.
For the premillennialism that I grew up with, if you are a dispensational premillennialist, like I would say 90% of Southern Baptists are, maybe 80% of the evangelicals in the world, in the United States are. But so if you believe in premillennialism the way that I believed it, grew up believing it, then you can't believe that that the next event is going to be the eternal state. I mean, there's a bunch of things that have to happen before that, like the Great Tribulation and the rapture and all of these things. But I guess in historic premillennialism, there is a much more of a commonality with and post, in the sense that, like you just said, there is going to be a 1,000-year reign, but it's not going to be there's not going to necessarily be a rapture and a great tribulation.
No, I instead of using the term rapture, I would just like to say gathering, the resurrection. When Jesus comes back, I believe all believers will be bodily raised from their tombs, and those who are alive will be transformed in a moment and will be gathered together with Christ.
Yeah, I think we all agree.
So, like, if I'm alive when Jesus returns to the earth, I don't think I'll have to, like, buy a plane ticket to go see Jesus on the other side of the world. I think he'll immediately bring me into his presence.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and open up the audience. Now, Brother Jim may have I have to warn you, he may have something to say about Revelation 20. I don't know.
Well, let's do, I do have a microphone here, but I also have this lapel mic here. Did you?
I think he had a question to follow up on what was just stated. Do you mind if we start with his?
Who?
He had
Sure.
Hey, get on the mic.
Come on over here first. This one's on right here if you want to get up, and then if you
We have to get it on the mic, y'all, not because we want to embarrass y'all, but we want to get it on the recording.
When Christ returns in the premillennial view, all saints will reign with Christ, and what will happen to unbelievers?
They'll still be, Christ will destroy all unbelievers on the earth. I mean, I heard
just talk into it.
Yeah, so Christ will destroy all unbelievers on the earth. That's what's described in Revelation 19.
At his coming, when he sets up the millennium.
That's right. Okay. So he will destroy all unbelievers on the earth. He will raise all believers to life at the same time.
What's going to happen at the end of the 1,000 years?
At the end of the 1,000 years, he will raise the unbelievers. That's the second resurrection.
And judge them eternally?
That's right. That's the great white throne judgment.
But he's not doing that when he first comes back.
No, the final judgment happens after.
So, but they're in hell during the 1,000 years.
Well, I would say they are in torment, but I think hell in the New Testament, this is a different point. Right. And I think we're all going to agree on this, by the way, because this isn't unique to premillennialism. The eternal lake of fire is the final judgment.
Okay.
And I don't believe that anyone is in hell right now. I think that final judgment will only happen at the very end of history. Would you guys agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that's not unique to my view.
Okay. I have another question for the post-mill view. So I see a lot of post-mills talk about, and I guess the big point of it is the world would be Christianized before Christ returns. And I see a lot of people, and they use the fact, like you said earlier, there's churches on every corner, and obviously, that wasn't the case so long ago. But at the same time, we see more churches and things like that. I feel like there's also a turning away of the true gospel, and so a lot of the churches that we do see are really not true churches. And so I would just want to see what you would have to say about, just because we see a lot of churches, that doesn't necessarily mean that the world's actually being Christianized.
Right.
Right.
Right, exactly. Because it's a slow process. I don't want to, it's a mischaracterization of post-mill to say things just get better and better. Every day is better than the day before. You're going to have fits and starts and ups and downs, but the overall progress is working in that direction. And so, sure, there's a lot of bad churches. There's a lot of false gospel being preached, and postmillennialism does not preclude that from happening. It's ups and downs and backs and forths. It's similar, and I hope this isn't too long of an illustration, but several years ago, our church had a business meeting that got a little contentious, believe it or not, and and it was because there was a misunderstanding about our church finances in one particular month. We had spent more than what we had taken in that month. And so, it was like the sky was falling. If we were going to go bankrupt, we're running out of money and everything else. And we had to say, whoa, wait a minute. Let's look at the year to date. And over the last several months, we had taken in lots more than we had spent. It was just 1 month that it was down. And so if you zoom in, it looks really bad. But if you zoom out, you see the big picture. And so, like I said, if you zoom in, sure, you're going to see those types of things. But we have a long way to go. We could very easily be still in the early church. We're only 2,000 years in. If it goes on another 10,000 years, this is just a small little blip in the last, generation of going backwards a bit. And so, postmillennialism is robust enough to envelop all of that. Does that help?
Yeah, it helps. I just, like I said, a lot of post-mills insinuate the amount of churches and quote unquote evangelicals and Christians in the world, but because
they're trying to compare it to when that didn't exist at all. But so like us three guys, I don't know how many books you have in your library, Rusty, but I'm assuming a good many, and Brian more. But compare our libraries
I had as many dollars
to
as I
our
had
counterparts, 200 years ago. A couple hundred years ago, that they would have, there would have been no way they could have had a fraction of the resources that we have, not to mention what we carry around in our pockets, more than the library at Alexandria. So things are not as good as they will be. What's it going to be like for pastors pastoring our church, these churches, Reformation Church, 500 years from now? A lot of us haven't even thought about that. It blows our mind to even think about that. But
Premills don't think we're going to be around for 5
we're not going to be around, and that's what we were
I actually
raised
think.
not thinking about.
I mean, Christ might take 10,000 more years.
Right.
I mean, I have no idea when He'll return.
Yeah, and so if that's the case, there's room for a lot more progress to be made. Yeah.
I know Jim did have a question. There are other questions too, so. No. Here, just let me set this there.
So good.
In Revelation 20, of course, it says at the beginning that Satan will be thrown into the bottomless pit, and that it will be sealed over him and so on, that he might not deceive the nations any longer. And then it says, until 1,000 years were ended. And after that, he must be released for a little while. Is the teaching then, is what Revelation is saying here, that Satan will be shut up for 1,000 years, that the 1,000-year period will come to an end at some point, and when it comes to the end, that Satan will be released again for a little while. Will he, when he is released, begin to resume deceiving the nations, for one thing? And also, why is he released at all? Why isn't he just kept locked up?
So I don't know that I can tell you why, other than I can tell you that's what the text says. I mean, I'd have to ask God why. But yes, he will be released at the end of the 1,000 years and deceiving the nations for a little while. I believe that's explained in verses 7 to 10. So if I could just read that, I think it's referring to what's about to come. So starting in Revelation 20, verse 7, when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog. That's a reference to Ezekiel chapter 38. I won't even take time to explain that other than to say just look it up. He's tying this text to Ezekiel 38. So Satan will come out of the bottomless pit, deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. And their number is like the sand of the sea. And they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints in the beloved city. But the fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were. They were thrown in, the beast and the false prophet were thrown into the lake of fire in chapter 19, by the way. That's another reason to see Revelation 19 and 20 as linear, because he mentions something that happened earlier in 19 and says the beast and the false prophet were thrown into the lake of fire in chapter 19. Now in chapter 20, Satan joins them. He's also thrown into the lake of fire after the millennium, and the beast and the false prophet were thrown in before. And I just think that's another reason to read this as one linear vision. So the devil was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. And that's the final judgment. And then in the following verses in the great white throne, unbelievers are thrown in there with them. And that's the eternal state of hell.
So then in your understanding, Satan will be in the bottomless pit, the abyss, for 1,000 years.
Not necessarily exactly 1,000 years, but what Revelation calls 1,000 years.
All right, whether it's literal or figurative, it'll still be
a long period of time.
1,000 years, long period of time.
Yeah.
And then at the end of that 1,000 years, whether figurative or literal, he'll be released for a short while.
A very short while, just long enough to rebel against Jesus, and then Jesus will immediately destroy him and all the unbelievers who have been raised.
We don't know when he's released that time. We don't have any information on what the time frame would be for him being released, how long he would be released.
Oh, no, it's just a short while. That's all it says. But when he's released, it's at the same time that the unbelievers are raised in the second resurrection. He's released for the purpose of deceiving the nations that were just raised from the dead. And as I said before, that's unbelievers throughout time in history, right? From Cain's day through...
Okay, so then in your position, Christ returns before the millennium. The millennium takes place. At the end of that 1,000-year millennium, then Satan is released, resumes deceiving the nations, and then after the end of that little while, then Satan is finally destroyed, thrown into the lake of fire, and so on. So that would be the premillennial position. The postmillennial position then would be that Christ does not come back until the end of the 1,000-year period. So he comes back at the same time Satan is released from the bottomless pit. So after Christ returns, then Satan is released. And then comes that little while during which Satan has resumed deceiving the nations, and then Christ finally defeats him, sending him to the lake of fire. Would that be accurate?
I believe so. Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, I don't know if I would make it that granular that right at the end of that 1,000 years, in that little while that Christ is returning, he is judging. Yeah, that's what the text says. And so, but the significant area there is it's a little while. The comparison is 1,000 years is long and broad. And I think I'll go ahead and say this. I think the 1,000 years is not only speaking of a long period of time, time, but it's also symbolic of an expansiveness. And so the scope, the length, the breadth, everything is long compared to the release of Satan is short and minimal there at the end, because Christ is judging him.
And then the amillennial position would be that we have a realized millennium that is going on right now, with 1,000 years being symbolic and not literal. And at the end of this period, whenever that takes place, then Satan will be released from the bottomless pit for a period of time, and then Christ will return. So the amillennial position would see that as the millennium, as this realized millennium ends and Satan is released, so conditions in the world will get significantly worse because Satan is released and he is able to go and deceive the nations again for a period of time, at the end of which then Christ will destroy Satan by throwing him into the lake of fire.
Yes.
So, Rusty, I think I follow what he's saying. You accurately stated my position. I think you accurately stated postmillennialism. Do you think you did, Don?
I think so.
Now, he made an interesting point about Amil. So, Rusty, would you understand Satan being unbound at the end of the millennium as like correlating to the Olivet Discourse, the Great Tribulation, and that Antichrist, that intense persecution? Do you think those might correlate?
I do. I don't want to speak for all millennials. There may be some parity there. I'm not sure.
All right, anyone else? Travis, you can't take all the questions.
So the premillennialist position, who is Satan going to deceive when he's released? If it's just Christ and his followers that are reigning with him in the millennium, is he going to deceive those that are actually reigning with Christ?
No. He'll deceive unbelievers who will be raised at that time. So at the end of the millennium, Satan will be released from the bottomless pit, and unbelievers will be raised in the second resurrection. So that the ones that Satan will deceive will be the unbelievers who were just resurrected.
Okay.
I don't believe, I said this earlier, I just want to make this clear. A lot of dispensationalists claim that believers during the millennium will have children and their children will be unbelievers, and the unbelieving children of believers born during the millennium will be those who rebel. I don't think there's any indication of that in the text. I don't think that makes any sense. I don't think that there will be unbelieving children. I don't even know if people will have children in the millennium, but regardless of that, I don't think that anyone in the millennium will be an unbeliever, because I believe that Satan being bound so that he cannot deceive the nations means that no one will be an unbeliever on the earth during the millennium.
That's I appreciate that insight, because I certainly didn't know what historic premillennialists believed in that.
Making in your millennium.
That's not the millennium.
I'm just asking. So
I don't know. I mean,
no. What?
I don't know if I can answer that question. Jesus talks about in heaven we won't marry and be given in marriage. I don't know if that refers to the millennium or not, or just the final state, the new heavens and the new earth. I'm not sure if believers during the millennium will be able to have children.
What we're saying, Travis,
sure.
is that dispensationalists do believe that during the millennium you can have children, and they'll be, by the way,
Right, I was just trying
under the curse of death, because people will still be dying.
I was just trying to understand it to that position.
Yeah, I don't think
Isaiah
there's-
11, Brian. Isaiah 11 has children playing with cobras in the millennium. So
Yeah.
there's children.
They would be born in
Oh, I think that's symbolic of the effects of the curse being reversed.
All right.
I certainly believe that children are born during the millennium. Because we're in the millennium right now. Children will be born. But what about people dying in the millennium?
I don't believe people will die. I don't think that's how we should understand Isaiah 65. We could walk through Isaiah 65 if you want, but I think a man living to old age, and I think all of those things indicate that the curse from the garden has been reversed. So I believe we'll have glorified bodies in the millennium. I believe everyone on the earth during the millennium will not age, will not get sick. I believe everyone on the earth during the millennial reign of Christ will be a believer. And if believers can have children, and I'm not sure if they can or not, I don't know if the Bible answers your question. I can't think of anywhere that it does. But if they were able to have children, they would have to be believers, because Satan is bound. He cannot deceive people. But I don't see any reason to think that people are going to have children during the millennium.
Do you think that's pretty much par for the course for all historic premillennials?
Not necessarily. I've heard historic premillennialists who believe that believers will have children during the millennium and that some of them will be unbelieving. I don't, like I said, there's variance in all of our views. So I'm an expert in my own opinion.
Anything else?
Possibly 2 Peter. Does anybody want to touch on that?
Which part of it?
No.
Verse, anyways.
Because it kind of
While we're looking
runs.
for that,
It kind of
does
runs
anyone-
from the return of Christ to the final state.
Yeah.
It's a long passage. Is there a certain aspect of it?
Dealing with the false teachers.
I got to look at it, but I think that's at the very beginning of chapter 3, 2 Peter 3.
2 Peter.
2 Peter what?
2 Peter 2,
Oh, okay.
the judgment of false teachers.
Yeah, and that's also, he's kind of expanding on what's in Jude in 2 Peter 2. They're parallel. So what would be your question about the text?
Okay, considering that we have a lot of false teaching going on right now, what aspect would that be considered toward the post of the Arminian state?
Like where does that fit into our views is what you're asking?
I guess, again,
Okay.
it's kind of pointed towards Don with postmillennialism as apparently with 2 Peter with all the false teaching and as the apostle is showing what's going on.
Yeah, well, there was false teachers in Peter's day, and he was dealing with those. They were real people. I just finished preaching through 2 Peter very slowly. It took about a year, and so verse by verse through. And my impression is that Peter was being so specific, especially there in chapter 2, that the people that were hearing that for the first time were looking around saying, "Oh, we know who he's talking about," because they're talking about their personalities and what their proclivities were and all the rest. And so he's dealing with a very particular issue there. But I think the impetus of your question is postmillennialism is large enough to understand that there were false teachers in those days, there are false teachers now, and there'll be false teachers in the future, definitely, pretty much throughout the church age. Now that will minimize at some point when we get to the tipping point, but for the foreseeable future, 2 Peter is going to be very helpful for the church and especially for us today.
So the difference in my view, and I think Rusty would share this, tell me if you do, Rusty, that when Scripture says that in the last days, evil men and impostors will go on from bad to worse, deceiving and being deceived, I think that indicates that there will be more false teachers as history moves forward and not less. Would you agree with that, Rusty?
Yeah, I would disagree. I think that passage there is speaking specifically of specific individuals. He says those people, and that's the tendency of wicked men. When they start going in that direction, they just go from bad to worse. And so he's not speaking in a general sense of how many or how bad it will be in influencing the culture of the church, but those specific people in his day especially, and is true throughout time when someone goes in that direction. So that passage is speaking specifically of particular individuals will go from bad to worse.
I would even allow, I don't know if Brian would go this far with me, but I would even allow that it is possible that in the end days, when Jesus comes back, that he would find a church that is that has been so faithful that in spite of the proliferation of false teachers that are in the world, that the church is being faithful to condemn them and to even, what's the word there, withstand them, to combat them, although the church would not have eradicated them. Now, would the postmillennialist position say no, they would be eradicated at the return by the
No,
return
I
of
don't
Christ?
think so.
Okay.
No, because there's always going to be that wiggle room for opposition and anything.
Okay.
Now, Brian's position is that they would be eradicated.
Before the return of Christ?
That who will be eradicated?
False teachers,
False teachers.
during the millennium.
No.
Yeah, only during the millennium.
Before the return.
No,
Right, yeah.
no, he was saying it's getting from bad to worse.
Yeah, right.
And I wouldn't say it'd be completely eradicated. There's
Before the
always
return
gonna
of
be-
Christ.
Right.
Yeah.
But I do believe, like in Matthew 24, remember it says, after this time, there will be a time of great tribulation, as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And we are told that the Antichrist or the lawless one will deceive people, and even if it were possible, he would try to deceive the elect, but he won't be successful in deceiving the elect. The Olivet Discourse mentions that. Mm-hmm. I believe that means what you're saying, Rusty, that the church is going to resist these false teachers.
Yeah.
I expect there to be more false teachers as history moves forward, and I think the church to grow stronger, both spiritually and in number, and that the church will go stronger even as the world grows more wicked. And there will be a greater difference. Like, we have lived in a time when there is this like post-Christian culture in America where everyone thinks they're a Christian, but very few people follow Jesus. Right. And I think as time moves forward, we're going to know who the Christians and the non-Christians are. Because when Christians are being severely persecuted for their faith, no one wants to be a Christian except someone who has actually been purchased by the blood of Christ.
I agree. And I would say, along those lines, that what many in the church would think, generationally speaking, many people in the church today, especially older people in the church today, would think that the church was stronger, for example, in the 50s. I think that the church is going to be strong, much, much stronger in the near future than it was in the near past.
Amen. I agree.
I would think that.
Have any more questions this evening? I think we got one over here. Hang on a second.
He's from my church, so you got to let him ask his question.
Oh, yeah. I'll even give you the thing. Just into that.
There's a plant.
Yeah.
You got to have some.
Okay, so would y'all believe that the mark of the beast is literal or non-literal?
But the what is?
The mark of the beast,
Okay.
symbolic or non-symbolic?
It would be symbolic.
So I believe, I believe it's symbolic. I think many things in Revelation are symbolic. So the mark of the beast is essentially following after this evil world system. The mark of the beast is compromising with evil. It's being pressured to disobey God. The world, it's saying that a man is a woman and a woman is a man because the culture pressures you to do that. And the world doesn't want you to be able to have a living. They want to cancel you. They want to make you lose your job because you won't use their correct pronouns, right? And I think that is an indication of the mark of the beast. And that type of persecution of believers is going to get worse and worse and worse.
In that sense, and Brian's right, it kind of both. 666 on the forehead, symbolic. But there's always something literal behind the symbolism. I've always told the church, so when you drive down the interstate, you see a hamburger up on the sign on a McDonald's sign up there, nobody climbs up the sign, nobody says, "Oh, I'm so hungry," pulls over, climbs up the sign, takes a bite. They know that is pointing to something that is real, but that is not what is real. real. What is real is what is being pointed to.
And the reason I think it's 666 is because in the book of Revelation, and I bet we all agree on this, in the book of Revelation, the symbols that we have are often represented by different numbers. 7 is completeness and perfection based on the 7 days of creation. 6 is usually related to the beast, the false prophet, and the dragon, and that is Satan's false imitation of God's perfection. I think 666 is saying essentially Satan's false caricature of what God says is good. It's incomplete, it's wicked, and so the mark of the beast being 666 is Satan leading the world to reject what God has said is good, and Satan trying to redefine what is good. So that Satan says two men marrying one another, not that there is such a thing as two men getting married, but two men being in a romantic relationship with one another is good, and the Bible says, no, it's not, it's an abomination. And so 666 is representative of Satan and the world claiming that which is evil is good and good is evil. And that's how I understand the mark of the beast. Would you guys agree with that?
Yeah, I think that would be the idealist application that is legitimate. On top of the fact, I'm also a preterist, and so I think it's important to point out that in the first century, those that would have been reading the book of Revelation, they knew exactly who the beast was. Everybody knew the beast was Nero. Nero would have been the beast, and any association with the state that was in cahoots with the false prophet of apostate Israel against the church were at work together, and I think that's some of the symbolism.
And I would somewhat agree that Nero is a type of that, and I think there's a dual fulfillment there,
right?
Where I think many things in the book of Revelation do indeed refer to events in the first century, but they don't exclusively refer to events in the first century. And I think you would maybe say that they're exclusively referring to first century events, and I would say they both refer to that, but more centrally they refer to the battle between good and evil that's been going on in this world ever since the death, burial, resurrection, and ascension of Christ.
Sure.
One more question, please. Y'all brought that up earlier, and I was just curious as to what y'all meant by if it was symbolic or literal, and that's why I was curious. Another thing. So y'all say the mark of the beast is more people giving into the world's false system, yes. Would you then believe that we can lose our always saved status or saved status?
No, so in the book of Revelation, believers have the name of Christ written on their forehead. Unbelievers have 666 written on their forehead. I think both are symbolic. Like, I don't think you need to go get a tattoo of Jesus across your forehead. I mean, you can do it if you want to, but it's kind of weird. But anyways, so I would say it is symbolic. And in Revelation, you have believers and unbelievers, those whose names are written in the Lamb's Book of Life and those whose names are not written in the Lamb's Book of Life. Those who have Christ's name on their forehead, those who have 666 on their forehead, those who worship the beast, those who don't worship the beast, and so on and so forth.
Anybody else?
Have we worn everybody out?
I don't know, man. I know it seems like how much longer do you think y'all could go?